next presenter is Margaret Ward. She is presenting a paper written and was to be presented by Professor Lesley Chenoweth, who is the inaugural Professor of Social Work and currently head of Logan campus at Griffith University. Lesley has more than 35 years experience as a social work and human services practitioner, academic and activist, chiefly in the disability area. But she could not be here today. Margaret Ward has had many roles in her life as an architect, public servant, parent, researcher and advocate for the inclusion of all citizens. She has spent much of her career working towards the inclusion of people with disability in all aspects of that, as well as the adoption of housing design which includes everyone regardless of age and disability. She has been a mentor to many parents of people with disability, advocates and allies in the sector, and has been a hero of mine for many years. Margaret will deliver Lesley's paper in her stead.
Good morning. Lesley apologises for not being here in person. She's been excited about doing this event for some time, but unfortunately she's had an emergency, family emergency. So I've been asked to provide this presentation on her behalf. I hope I can do it with the same enthusiasm that she does for the history of institutions. Some of our earliest records of caring for people in large hospital-type settings comes from ancient Greece and Rome and the Muslim world. In ancient Rome, care for the sick and disabled was linked to religious observations, for example, visiting shrines and healing baths. The earliest military rehabilitation hospitals originated from Roman valetudinaria, establishments within fortresses where injured soldiers were treated often with great success. The Muslim world pioneered institutional care for the mentally ill. Perhaps the first psychiatric hospital was set in Baghdad in 705 AD under the leadership of the Umayyad Caliph. These soon expanded to other cities in the then Arab world, Cairo, Damascus, and included the earliest medical schools, so-called houses of wisdom. Physicians of the Islamic world invented a variety of treatments, including occupational therapy, music therapy, and medicines. Here are some examples of valetudinaria. They look like institutions, don't they? The care of people with mental illness and disability was based in the Quran texts. For example, and I quote, "Do not give the property with which God has entrusted you to the insane, but feed and clothe them with this property and speak kindly to them." What is interesting here is that it advocates compassion and proper care, but cautions against giving them possessions or property. The picture is of the Al-Adadi hospital around the 9th century. Early periods of Christianity saw religious communities, monks, nuns, caring for the poor, the sick, the insane, and pilgrims, all in together. These tended to be cared for in facilities attached to churches, abbeys, or monasteries. Very early, these tended to be small, based on 12 beds after the 12 apostles, and there was an unassailable link between serving the poor, the sick, and serving God. Of course, at this time, the insane, as they were called, were regarded as possessed by the devil, so it was not all good. In a short time, however, the rising population of those needing care outstripped the capacity of these small, modest hospices to provide it. Expansion was usually on the basis of doubling the 12 beds in long rows or spokes from the central point of the altar. These grew larger and more crowded, and the institutions expanded accordingly. In fact, these designs of rows and spokes with central viewpoint, Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, are still with us today in prisons, hospitals, and nursing homes. We can see here some examples. With the Age of Enlightenment, however, came some reform and new thinking about the care of people with disabilities. The focus on the development of modern medicine and sciences brought a new view of mental illness and intellectual disability as medical illnesses rather than demonic possession. This heralded a brief resurgence of the need for compassion, work that was pioneered by Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England. Tuke's moral treatment, provided in a York asylum, advocated humane treatment where the inmates were freed from chains, treated with kindness, and had freedom to pursue daily activities in more attractive surroundings. With the Industrial Revolution, more and more people moved to the major cities and institutions for the insane and intellectually disabled. Again, huge population expansion led to overcrowding again and appalling conditions. In the late 19th and early 20th century, asylums often doubled in size. In the US, the population of institutions increased by 927%. Facilities built for 1,200 people were housing more than 2,500 people. These large institutions flourished in most industrialised cities in the world. Often these were located on the outskirts of towns, causing segregation, and housed people with a wide range of conditions in congregation. Such facilities were often the major industry of the town, offering employment to the majority of the population. And Queensland Challiners Centre is a prime example, as is with Charters Towers. So here we have an institution in the USA, one in the UK, and homegrown Queensland's institution, Challoner and Basil Stafford Centre. So what can we learn from this history? Let's turn now to some of the fundamental ideas and assumptions that underpin institutions. First, it's important to acknowledge that early institutions across history started out with good intentions. The motivation was to protect people from the pressures of the outside world, to give them asylum, and later to offer treatment. But inherent in this was also the belief that society needed to be protected from its inmates. Overcrowding seemed inexorable. However, whatever period of history we explore, demand always inevitably outstrips supply. There are many reasons for this, but I think it is important to remember that it has always been the outcome. Build it and people will come. Historically, the insane, intellectually disabled, demented and sick were all housed together. It was during the Enlightenment that we began to separate out different categories of people, first on a pseudo-scientific basis and later through medical diagnosis. We still have remnants of this, however, where people with intellectual disability are still living in psychiatric hospitals, people with severe brain injury and nursing homes, and of course, as Graham mentioned, the overrepresentation of people with intellectual disability in prisons. It also seems inevitable that whatever the good intentions, institutions end up not being good for people. Abuse and neglect flourish in these environments. So there are many conflicting and conflicted approaches inherent in institutional models. The desire to treat with compassion is countered by a culture of punishment and constraint. The tension between social care and social control is still a fundamental tension today. The entrenched culture of institutions persisted and still persists. In any move to change such as community living, it is this entrenched culture that is hardest to shift, harder than merely bringing down the buildings. This is evidenced in the phenomenon of trans-institutionalisation that saw practices, cultures and routines of institutions firmly based in community settings. Vested interests kept institutions going and made change difficult. For example, employment issues, unionised workforces and community fears, and I'm sure Jeremy will cover some of this in his presentation. So the shift to community was long and difficult and significantly is still going on. So what examples from history do we have where people with disabilities are not institutionalised? Most provision of care for adults was always and has always been family or community based. But much of what has been written on the history of such care has been dominated by interest in institutions. The reality is that throughout history, many people with disability have remained in the community. It is just not a history that's well recorded. There has been a dominance of the institution in historical studies, so we do not have the records or accounts to draw upon for the alternative. So here are a few examples of where people with disability were not placed in institutions. This is by no means exhaustive, but it offers a different narrative. In the 19th century, some people with intellectual disabilities were left with families, usually the most wealthy or the more wealthy families who had the means to do so. Most poor families had to work in factories at the time. Some outdoor relief was provided under the poor laws, and workhouses were seen as the last resort. Community care was actually formally provided in UK legislation in 1913 in the Mental Deficiency Act. The Act categorised people in line with their capacity to work. Idiot was reserved for those with severe impairments. Imbecile for those unable to work but more able. And feeble-minded for those able to earn their own living in favourable circumstances. The generic term for people with intellectual disability was mental defectives. This Act included institutions, but it also provided for arrangements where people could be cared for under supervision by ordinary citizens in the community under a form of guardianship. The feeble-minded, for example, were often licensed to work under supervision. In the 20th century, many people with so-called mild intellectual disability lived and worked in communities, e.g. as farm labourers. But as these jobs disappeared, so did the opportunities for people to live in the community. But the essential reality for most people with disabilities is that they have always been cared for by families. The family is one of the oldest institutions. From ancient Rome to today, the primary support for people with a disability is their family. Most people with disability live with and are supported by families. And the family is our major source of care and therefore needs to be supported. When societal circumstances change, such as with the Industrial Revolution, we find alternatives proliferating. When the capacity to care is diminished by the demands of having to work or other factors such as differing values, we find institutions start to grow. Even the expansion of nursing homes for older people, while seemingly being for most old people, only serve around 5% of people over 65 and over 20% for those over 84 and for a very short time. My final point is that institutional cultures still pervade, whether we look at group homes, specialised facilities for younger people with disabilities, frail older people, and indeed now asylum seekers. So this quote from Digby illustrates. The lesson of history is that it does not repeat itself precisely, yet in a broader front, certainly policy issues, dilemmas, problems, and choices do recur in social welfare. To forget the past record of these events is to force each generation to relearn what should already be known and thus make future developments less satisfactory than they might be. So I finish with this last slide of our next generation of institutions, the Curtin Detention Centre. Thank you.